Hello guys, so my name is Amit. So today our topic is types of database. So from today's lecture we are going inside of database. We will learn about all the types of database available and why we want to choose, for which cases we want to choose which type of database. So we have couple of types of database. One is RDMS, you can see key value, document, white column graph, a lot of types of database are there. Choosing a database for your applications is the most important thing. Okay, if you choose a wrong type of database for your use cases, the application's performance will get heavily distorted. Okay, so now in the type of database, first we will come to RDMS. Okay, so what is the full form of RDMS? RDMS means relational database management system. Okay, relational database management system. So what happens in RDMS? The data gets stored in table format. The data gets stored in table format in row and column architecture. So why it is used, right? It has very structured data in the fixed schema. So the schema is fixed in this type of database, and the data that we store in this type of database is always having structured data, right? Because the data gets stored in row and column basis in the table format. So the structure of the data is always fixed, okay, in this RDMS type of database. So this type of database, it gets used when we have, when we need join relationship. So what is relationship? Here in this particular database, two tables, suppose T1 and T2, can be having a relationship using a foreign key. So what is foreign key? We will talk about later, but just consider that using a foreign key, that means using a common key, we can have a relationship between two tables in this type of database, and using that foreign key only, you can have complex join operations to fetch out the data. Okay, complex join operations to fetch one data. So all the transactional data. Another thing is when we need database transactions. Okay, so what is database transactions? We'll talk about later, but this is one of the beautiful feature that we have in RDMS. So that's why all the banking related application mostly use any transactional data they want to store, they will use always SQL or Oracle database, that is type of relational database. So the next type of database is also one of the most famous database for caching, right? So whenever you want to capture any key value pair database, right? For any key there will be certain values. So this type of data where you want to store, map data structure where you have one key and one value, right? So any data where we have key value pair, there we use key value pair database, that is the Redis and dynamodb is the most widely used key value pair database, and that is used for fast lookup. So where is the fast lookup? What is the use case? Caching is the most widely used fast lookup database, right? Use case. Another is the session data storage. So if we want to store any session data also, we use this key value pair database, right? So these are the most commonly used use cases of key value pair database. Okay, so we will go deep dive. Okay, next lecture onwards we will go one by one database and we will go deep dive. In this lecture I just want to have a walkthrough of all the database on a very high level, so that when we go deep dive you can at least relate what exactly we are talking about. So the next type of database is the document type database. Okay, so when you want to store a big JSON, right? So when you don't have any fixed schema, you are flexible with the schemas, right? So when you don't have any fixed schema like RDMS, you have flexible schema, and the data we have in JSON format, right? So there in this complete JSON can be stored in a database that is called document database. So the most widely used document database is the MongoDB. Most widely used document database is MongoDB. Couchbase DB also nowadays is getting used, but what I have seen in my career, MongoDB is the most widely used document database, and CouchDB also nowadays getting used. So another type of database is white column database. Okay. So now, okay, I forgot to tell you the use case about document database. So where exactly document database can be used? So anywhere the data is getting used as in JSON, right? So you have API, microservices. So whenever you are working in API or microservices, in API microservices, JSON is the common data format. So you know, whenever you are working with JSON and microservices, you want to store the complete input JSON, output JSON. So there you use generally MongoDB or CouchDB as a document type database. So the next type of database is white column database. Okay. So why white column database is? What is white column database? So the main USP of white column database is it gives very high write throughput, very high write throughput. So what happens if you want to have any heavy write applications, right, where you have millions of write in a particular second. So there exactly you have to use the white column database, and the most commonly used white column database is Cassandra. Okay, Cassandra, Google Big Tables. So these two are most widely used white column database. So you know, and another thing is you can see white column. Why? Because in RDMS what happens, right? The value gets stored column wise, right? So for each column the data gets stored for each row. But here the grouping happens, here you know, in RDMS the grouping happens based on column. But in white column database the grouping happens based on rows. Okay, we will go deep dive in the next lecture. For white column database is just you understand the grouping happens based on rows in white column database, whereas in RDMS the grouping happens in based on columns, right? And the use case of white column database is large scale write, where you need to have very heavy write applications. There you have to use Cassandra or Google Big Tables as in database, so that this database can give very high throughput in the write operations. Okay. Next is graph database. So by the name only you can understand what is graph, right? So when you have multiple relations with each node, I mean each data, right? So when the relationship matters most, you know, rather than data, so you know there is graph database is used. So you know what is an example? Suppose you know social networking service where each node must have any connections between each other, right? When the connections between each node is applicable, right? And you know the data gets formatted in a graph format. So there we use the graph database, and the most commonly used graph database is Neo4j, and Neptune also gets used, Amazon Neptune. So graph database is when the relationship between data is more important than rather than the data, there we use graph write format data, there we use graph database. So another is time series. Time series means whenever you have to store the data in a particular time interval, there you have to use the time series database. Just for an example, you can see the stock price, right, where you have to store the stock price in a particular time interval, right? Suppose each second you have to calculate the stock price and you have to make a graph. So in this type of applications, you have to use the time series database. The most commonly used is InfluxDB and Prometheus. InfluxDB I have seen couple of applications is using, right? So what is the use case? Use case is whenever you have to store the data in a particular time interval. So the data gets stored like this: timestamp, value, and one tag. Okay. So every timestamp the corresponding value gets stored, and corresponding tags also they store. This tags helps this particular database to search the data. Okay. So we will go deep dive corresponding lectures for this database. Just now you understand this time series database is used only when in every time interval you have to store the data, there you have to use the time series database. So another type of database is where you need to have text search, okay, heavy text search, okay, fast text search, okay, there you have to use search type of database. And this is actually used mostly in logs. What I have seen in logs, what happens, suppose you have 10 microservices, okay, and for each microservices you want to store a data in a centralized database, right? So what happens, right? Suppose there is a stack called ELK where is Elasticsearch, Logstash and Kibana, right? So Logstash is an engine which gets installed in each microservices and it feeds the logs to Elasticsearch, okay, to Elasticsearch database, okay. All the logs, all the text comes in Elasticsearch database, and Kibana is a portal, right? In UI Kibana we search the logs, we search in a text, right, and all the related data based on this search comes out from Elasticsearch, okay. So Elasticsearch actually used when you have very high text search requirement. So the most commonly fitted use case is logs and full text, right? Whenever you want to have a log stream or centralized logging algorithm, solutions, there you have to use Elasticsearch. The next type of database is object store database. Object store database, where you have to store the object. Object means what happens, like whenever suppose media applications, like suppose you have to store the video, right? So a video is a combinations of audio, the combinations of audio and the frame, right? Combinations of audio and frame. So these two things you have to store together as an object. Individually you can store, but together as an object you have to store. So where the object storage database is used when you have to store any files or any blob. Blob means binary large, right? So binary large object. So where the media, photo and all. So the most commonly used is Amazon S3. We have Azure blob storage also you can use, right? So there next is in-memory database. In-memory database. So what happens in in-memory database? Whenever you need a very low latency means very fast for accessing the data, right? So what happens in in-memory database, right? In memory. So by naming it, it is telling I am storing the data in my own memory, that is RAM, okay. So the data gets stored in RAM and it has very low latency in accessing the data, and the commonly used case is the same, you can use caching. Caching is also one of the commonly used use case for in memory, and the example is redis and memcached, okay. Redis and memcached is the most commonly used use case. So we have studied RDMS. What I told, RDMS is the relational one, key value is the key value pair data, document is the JSON data you have to store, white column is very high write throughput, graph is when the relationship matter most, time series is when you have to store the data in a particular time interval, search is whenever you have to have the very fast text search output, there you have to go to the search type of database, object store when you have to store the blob or file you have to go to the object storage, okay. In memory database is the one where exactly you have to have very low latency, where the data gets stored in RAM, then you have to go to the in memory database. So in this video what we have seen is we have seen all type of database available for our system design, and what is the example of the database is there for RDMS, mysql, key value pair, redis, document, mongodb, white column, Cassandra, graph, neo4j, time series, influxdb or Prometheus, search, Elasticsearch is the most widely used, object store is S3, in memory is redis or memcached, right? So whenever we will design our system, we will be using most of these particular databases for our system design, right? So you have to understand why we are using Redis, right? We have to understand why we are using MongoDB, Cassandra. So that's why I have given the USP of each database. Suppose RDMS is the structural data. When you have very structured data, fixed schema, we have to go to the RDMS. When you have very fast lookup, we want to have very fast lookup of the data based on a key, there we have to go to the key value pair database, that is Redis. Whenever we want to store JSON, then you have to go to the document type database. When you have to have very high large scale write, right, high write throughput, then you have to go to the white column database, that is Cassandra. When you have two nodes relation, multi-node relation, then graph is we have to use, that is Neo4j or Neptune. When you have to store the data in a particular time interval, then you have to go to the InfluxDB. When you have to have very high log search or text search, then you have to go to the Elasticsearch. Correspondingly, you have to store the blob, then you have to go to the S3. In memory, you have to store the Redis. So this is it for today. In the next lecture onwards, we will go deep dive into each database and we will understand very high level advantage, disadvantage and all these things in the next lecture onwards. Thank you so much for today.